The farewell was beautiful. The small choir, all in white, sang with the sweet sadness of angels forlorn. The coffin topped a small pyramid of close-packed blooms. At the four corners, guards in gowns of purple silk bowed their heads, each with a gilded palm frond in her hand. The bishop crossed the floor, laid his book carefully on the pulpit, and spoke. Our beloved sister Diana, and her work, which she now can never finish, for he giveth and he taketh away. And if he takes away the olive tree he has given us, before its fruit has ripened, it is for us to accept his will. O Diana, vessel of his divine inspiration, and change in the course of human history, we lay thee to rest. The eyes of the congregation, the several hundred women with a sprinkling of men, turned to the coffin. Slowly it started to move. The curtains dragged along the sides and fell to behind it. There was a whimper or two, the sound of caught breath, a dappling of small white handkerchiefs. As they left, Zephany and Richard became separated from her father. Zephany turned and saw him a few yards behind them. Among the press of women in the aisle, he seemed taller than he was. His handsome face told nothing. It looked only tired and unconscious of everything about him. Outside there were more women, hundreds of them, who had not been able to get into the chapel. Many were weeping. On the gravel, Zephany towed Richard clear of the stream. Her own eyes were moist, but for all that, a rueful smile touched the corners of her mouth. "Poor darling Diana," she said. "Just think how this would have amused her." St. Merin's High was holding its end-of-term party, and Miss Benbow let her gaze wander around the room, taking note of those she must have a word with in the course of the evening. Up at the far end, she saw Diana Brackley. Diana was certainly one who deserved congratulations. Crossing the room, she had a sudden glimpse of Diana through a stranger's eyes, no longer a schoolgirl, but an attractive young woman. Perhaps it was the dress that did it. 18, Diana was then, fairly tall and slender, with dark chestnut hair. Her mouth was a little reddened, for one must not go to a party undressed, and had just the quantity and colour to suit the occasion. At closer range, it was her grey eyes one noticed, not only because they were fine eyes, but more on account of their steadiness, the unembarrassed calmness with which they took in and considered. Miss Benbow realised that Diana had become a beauty. This thought was followed by a pleasant sense of congratulation, for in a school like St. Merin's you not only teach a child, you conduct a kind of jungle warfare on her behalf, and so you are entitled, surely, to feel some pride of achievement when you regard those whom you've helped to guide past peril. But then Miss Benbow had to call herself to order for taking unearned credit. Diana required little protection. No, one was glad Diana had done so well, but one must not take too much credit for it. She had worked hard and deserved success. The only thing that one could have wished, although it did seem a rather dreadful thing to wish, but nevertheless one did wish, that she were perhaps a little less, individual. By the time Miss Benbow was near the end of the room, Diana had seen her approaching. "Good evening, Miss Benbow." "Good evening, Diana. I did so want to congratulate you. It's splendid, perfectly splendid. Mind you, we all knew you'd do well." "Thank you so much, Miss Benbow. But it wasn't all me. I mean, I wouldn't have got very far without all of you helping me and telling me what to do, would I?" "That's what we're here for. But we are in debt to you too, Diana. Even in these days, a scholarship brings credit to a school, and yours is one of the best St. Merin's has ever gained. Your parents must be delighted." "Yes, agreed Diana with a touch of reservation. Daddy's very pleased. He likes the idea of Cambridge because he's always wished he'd been able to go himself. If I'd failed the scholarship, Cambridge would have been out of the question. It would have had to have been one of the red bricks. Some of the red bricks are doing very good work, said Miss Benbow, graduate of London. Oh, yes, of course. It's only that when you've made up your mind, having to do something else is a kind of failure, isn't it? Miss Benbow resisted being drawn along that line. And your mother, she must be very proud of your success. Yes, she said judicially. That's how Mummy feels about it. I mean, she must be very proud. But surely she is, protested Miss Benbow. She tries. She's really been awfully sweet about it. But why is it that mothers still think it's so much more respectable to be bedworthy than brainy? She inquired. Miss Benbow blinked. Something awkward was bound to crop up in conversation with Diana, but she took it straight. I think, she said judicially, that the brainy world is a mystery to most mothers, so they feel uncertain about it. But they are all, rather naturally, authorities on the other. She hesitated, then went on. Has it ever occurred to you that when the daughter of a domestic-minded woman chooses to have a career, she is criticising her mother by implication? I hadn't looked at it that way before. You mean they are always hoping that their daughters will fail their careers and so prove that they, the mothers I mean, were right all the time? You do dash off, don't you, Diana? Well, it does follow, doesn't it? I don't think we'll do any more following at the moment, said Miss Benbow, who then congratulated Diana again and wished her well in her university life. I'm terribly grateful for everything, Miss Benbow, and I'm so glad you're all so pleased. It's a funny thing, she added meditatively. I should have thought practically anybody could be bedworthy, if she put her mind to it, I mean. Miss Benbow declined to be re-entangled. I simply don't understand where she gets it from, said Mrs. Brackley, perplexed. Well, it wasn't from me, her husband told her. I've sometimes wished a bit of braininess did run in our family, but as far as I know, it never has. Anyway, I can't see that it matters very much where it came from. It wasn't really the braininess I was thinking about. No, it's this, well, I suppose you could call it independence. The way she keeps questioning things that don't need questioning. It's a kind of restlessness, Malvina Brackley persisted. No boyfriends, her husband observed bluntly. She could have boyfriends, if she wanted to. She's only got to learn to giggle and not say things that panic them. Very conventional neighbourhood, this. Uncivilised, too. Surely you don't want her to take up with any of its oafs. No, of course not. It's just, I know. It'd be more normal. But last time we talked to Miss Benbow, she predicted a brilliant future for Diana. Brilliant was the word. And it doesn't mean normal. You can't have it both ways. Don't you worry. She'll find her own way. Like my Aunt Annie. She wasn't quite ordinary. Why? What was wrong with her? She went to prison in 1912 for letting off firecrackers in Piccadilly. She threw them in among the horses' legs and caused such a tangle that the traffic was jammed from Bond Street to Swan and Edgar's. Then she climbed on top of a bus and shouted, "Votes for women," till they took her away. The family was very ashamed. Well, whatever Diana has, we have somehow transmitted it to her, and I think we've done a rather astonishing job. Of course we have, Harold, dear. We've every right to be proud. It's only... well, it's not always the most brilliant life that's the happiest, is it? I don't know. But I do know that brilliance can make other people happy. Me, for instance. And for a thoroughly selfish reason. Ever since she was a little girl, it's been on my conscience that I couldn't afford to send her to a first-class school. When your father died, I thought we might manage it. I went to the solicitors and put it to them. They were sorry but firm. The instructions were clear, they said. The money is in trust until she's 25. It cannot be touched.
You never told me about that, Harold.
Wasn't much point. You know, I think that was the shabbiest thing your father did. Leaving you nothing, but leaving our daughter £40,000 and then tying it up in the most formative years of her life. So I say, good for Diana. She's done for herself what I couldn't do for her. Harold Brackley broke off and looked around the small sitting room. Wasn't too bad. Bit shabby now, but comfortable. Still no regrets? He asked his wife. She smiled back.
None, darling, none at all. I shouldn't have been any happier for winning scholarships.
Darling, people aren't all alike. Diana isn't much like you, or me.
She doesn't know about the money, does she?
She knows there is some. She didn't ask how much. I just tried to give the impression of, well, nothing very much. It seemed wiser. After a pause, she inquired,
Harold, I expect it sounds very stupid to ask, but what does a chemist actually do?
I don't know. I should think we'd better ask her again. It turned out not to matter much to the Brackleys what a chemist did, for in the instance of her first year, Diana changed her mind and read biochemistry instead. And what a biochemist did was something her mother never did succeed in getting clear in her mind. The reason for this change lay somewhere in a lecture given by Francis Saxover, Professor of Biochemistry and head of Dar House Developments, a research house set up to justify his contention that discovery was not the sole province of huge companies. Saxover, widely regarded as an intellectual renegade, was then under 40. He was a spare man with an aquiline face who gave the impression of being a little over 6 feet and who talked rather than lectured. All Diana took away from the lecture was a mental picture of the lecturer, a strong impression of purposeful enthusiasm, and, of course, the sense of having discovered the only life work worthwhile. And so, the change of school to biochemistry, and so a lot of hard work, and so, in due course, an honours degree, and then the question of a job. Diana suggested Dar House Developments. This was not immediately acclaimed. "It's possible, on your showing," admitted her tutor, "but Saxover's pretty choosy. Can afford to be, on what he pays, of course. But the turnover of staff is said to be a bit high. Why don't you consider one of the big firms?" Diana favoured Dar House. "All right, I'll drop a line to Saxover for you. Incidentally, did you see that he's now produced a virus that produces sterility in the male locust? Admittedly, the female locust can go on producing female locusts for a number of generations without male assistance, but one feels it must end sooner or later, or there wouldn't be much sense in sex, would there?"
Of course, I hope you get the job if it's what you want, darling. But what is this Dar House place? Asked Mrs. Brackley. It's a research centre, Mummy. A big late 18th century house in a park. Dr. Saxover bought it nearly 10 years ago. He and his family live in a wing of the house, and the rest has been turned into offices and labs and so on. The coach house and the stables were converted into flatlets for the staff. It's a sort of community. It sounds like a very nice place, I'm sure. But we don't know much about this kind of thing, your father and I. What's puzzling us is, what does this place really do? What do they make there? They don't make anything, Mummy. Dar House isn't a factory. What happens is, well, as an example, Dr. Saxover had an idea about termites. White ants, you know, they eat houses. Houses? houses. Now, a termite chews up wood and swallows it, but by itself can't digest it. But there is a protozoan parasite living inside the termite that can. So, the Dar House people investigated the parasite and looked for a chemical that would be fatal to it. They patented it, and Dr. Saxover collects a royalty on every tin sold. Oh, that's roughly the way it works. White ants? How horrid, said Mrs. Brackley. I shouldn't like to work on ants. Oh, that was only one project, Mummy. There are several going at a time, on lots of different things. This place, are there many there? Well, I don't quite know how many. Somewhere around 60. Are many of them girls? Yes, the decencies are preserved, though I'm told that the incidence of marriage is quite high. However, not to worry, I haven't the least intention of joining the great majority yet awhile. Oh, you've not seen my new dress I've got for the interview. Come up and I'll show you. Diana never knew it, but the new dress came near to losing her the job. Not that there was anything wrong with it, on the contrary. It was made of a thin woolen material in a soft green which became her chestnut hair well, and, as did most of her clothes, looked quite a little more than its price. The sight of her caused Francis Saxover misgivings. In his near 10 years of managing Dar House developments, he had grown a little cagey. Diana looked eminently capable of provoking another of those situations that had set him wondering to his wife Caroline whether they had not better change the word developments to Holiday Camp and Lonely Hearts Bureau. Diana herself was puzzled to know why, after a promising start, the interview seemed to go less well. The situation would have been clearer to her had she been able to glimpse some of the precedents that were flitting through her prospective employer's mind. Saxover was recalling less striking persons than Diana, who had turned out to be sherbet powder in the waters of his peaceful community. On the other hand, and in Diana's favour, he noted that she was taking the interview absolutely straight, depending on her merits and making no attempt at charm. Out of fairness, he decided it was a case for a second opinion, and so, instead of introducing Diana to the staff dining room as intended, he invited her to luncheon, at which his wife Caroline was present. Over the meal his misgivings receded. She talked easily and intelligently to her host and hostess, exchanged some thoughts with their son Paul, who was then 12, upon the probable date of a successful Martian expedition, and did her best to get words out of their daughter Zephany, who regarded her with round-eyed awe. Afterwards he put it to Caroline, "Do we risk it, or should we be asking for more trouble?" Caroline had looked at him sadly. "Francis, dear, you really must stop burdening yourself with the idea that this place could, or should, run like a machine. It never will. And I like the girl. She's unusual. She's intelligent, and I rather think she's got good sense. So, if she has the knowledge and ability you need, then let her come." Diana got the job. Her arrival aroused considerable interest, both hopeful and wary. The quick-off-the-mark types tried their luck forthwith and found no encouragement. The subtler strategists went to work and somehow bogged down at an early stage. With these preliminaries as a guide, Dar began to make up its mind about her. "Beautiful but dumb," one of the chemists pronounced sadly. Wives and concerned maidens allowed themselves to relax a little. "Cold," they told one another hopefully, and not without undertones of self-satisfaction. Her acquaintanceship with male members of the staff either kept to a comradely note or grew distant, and this unpoachful disposition gradually put her on good terms with a number of the young women, so that by degrees she began to scoop out a niche for herself as an oddity. Her devotion to a decorative appearance even came to be regarded as a quirk, a kind of art form, like flower arrangement, practised by Diana for her own entertainment. "An odd child altogether," Caroline Saxover remarked. "She has the brains for one kind of life and some of the tastes that go with quite another. Just at present she seems to be becalmed in a kind of doldrums between them. She'll probably come to life quite suddenly." "Meaning that we shall suddenly find ourselves with another of those emotional catastrophes and lose another good worker," Francis said gloomily.
I'm beginning to get reactionary. Despite his misgivings, it became clear that Diana had settled into Dar, and Saxover found her to be a good worker. Her relations with her colleagues continued for the most part to be amiable, though somewhat detached. "With us, but not of us," Dar's second-in-command, Austin Daly, remarked. "There's more in that girl than she's allowing to meet the eye. At present, she has a schoolgirl crush on our Francis. I take no bets on what course she'll follow when it wears off. Should be surprising, sooner or later." One morning, after Diana had been some 8 months at Dar, the door of the room where she was working opened abruptly. She lifted her head from her microscope to perceive Francis Saxover standing in the doorway, saucer in hand, and a pained expression on his face. "Miss Brackley," he said, "I am told that it is a kindly concern of yours to see that my cat Felicia is sustained during her nocturnal activities. If it really is necessary, which I doubt, would you mind placing your saucer in a less traffic-prone place? This is the 3rd time I have almost fallen over my own feet in avoiding it." "Oh, I'm so sorry, Dr. Saxover," Diana apologised. "I usually remember to take it away when I come up. She generally does drink it, you know. Perhaps last night's thunderstorm scared her." She took the saucer of milk from his hand and carried it across to the bench. In the act of putting the saucer down, she bent to look at it more closely. During the thundery night, the milk had turned. At least, nearly all of it had. But there was a spot centred upon a dark speck that looked different. It appeared not to have turned. "That's funny," she said. Francis glanced at the saucer. "What were you working on yesterday, just before you poured this out?" he asked her. "That new batch of lichens, the MacDonald lot." He said, procuring a clean slide. He fished out the speck and placed it under the microscope. "Can you identify?" he asked. Diana's inspection did not take long. "It's from this lot," she said, indicating a pile of desiccated fragments, variegated by yellow spots along the edges. "Provisionally, I've called it Lichensis imperfectus tertius mongolensis secundus MacDonaldi." "Have you indeed?" remarked Francis. "Well," she told him defensively, "it isn't easy, you know. Nearly all lichens seem to be imperfecti anyway, and this happens to be the 3rd one I tackled out of the 2nd MacDonald batch." "Well, we must remember that the name is provisional," Francis said. "Antibiotic, do you think?" Diana asked. "It could be. Quite a number of lichens do have some antibiotic properties, so it isn't unlikely. It's 100 to 1 against it being a useful antibiotic, of course. Still, it doesn't do to skip chances. I'll take a look at it and let you know." He picked up the empty jar and filled it with the lichen, leaving about half the heap still under its cover. Then he turned to go. But before he reached the door, Diana's voice stopped him. "Dr. Saxover, how is Mrs. Saxover today?" she asked. He turned back, looking a different man, as if he'd taken off a mask to reveal the wretchedness beneath. He shook his head slowly. "The hospital says she's quite cheerful this morning. She doesn't know, you see. She still thinks the operation was successful. I suppose it's the best way, but... Oh, God." Then he turned to the door again and was gone before Diana could say anything more. The lichen went with him, and that was almost the last Diana officially heard of it for a long time. Caroline Saxover died a few days later. Francis seemed to go about in a trance. For a fortnight or more he roamed the place like the inversion of a ghost, his body present but his spirit elsewhere. Then suddenly he was not to be seen at all, having shut himself up in his laboratory. Austin Daly, who more or less forced his way in there, reported that he seemed to be working like a madman on half a dozen things at once, and predicted a breakdown. On the few occasions that he did appear at meals, his manner was so distant and strained that the children were half afraid of him. Diana found Zephany weeping miserably one afternoon. She did her best to comfort her, and took her along to her own lab and let her amuse herself with a microscope. The next day, she took the child for a 12-mile walk to get her out of the place. Francis, however, did not have a breakdown. He was probably saved from it by getting pneumonia. He got it badly, too, but when he slowly started to pick up strength again, it appeared to have broken the trauma, for it was almost as his normal self that he gradually revived. But it was his normal self with a difference.
"Daddy's quieter than he used to be," said Zephany, "and sort of gentler. But he spends an awful lot of time just sitting and thinking and not looking sad at all, more like somebody working out sums."
"I expect that's what he is doing," Diana told her. "Takes a lot of working out of sums to keep Da going, you know." What with one thing and another, the question of the possible antibiotic qualities of the lichen dropped out of Diana's mind and only recurred there after a few months. She felt sure that it must have been driven out of Francis's too, or she would have heard something, for Francis was not one to poach credit. With his recovery, however, it occurred to her that a note of some kind should be entered regarding the nature of the lichen. It was during one of Da's monthly soirees that the opportunity came, prompted by the arrival of another bale of botanical oddments from the far-wandering Mr. MacDonald. During refreshments, Francis, now almost his former self again, was following his usual practice of chatting with his staff. Encountering Diana, he thanked her for the kindness she had shown to his daughter. "Oh, but I enjoy it. Zephany's much too good company for me to ever have thought it a chore. By the way, Dr. Saxover, I've been meaning to ask you, do you remember that MacDonald lichen? Did it turn out to be interesting?" She asked the question casually, half expecting him to say he'd forgotten about it. To her surprise, for a brief but unmistakable moment, he looked startled. He covered up quickly, but the look had been there. He hesitated a moment before he replied, "I ought to have let you know long ago. I'm afraid I was mistaken. It turned out not to be an antibiotic at all," he said, before quickly moving on to speak to someone else. Later, Diana began to appreciate that not only was something a little amiss with that reply, it was also a silly thing for Francis to have said, and it niggled at the back of her mind. For some reason, the question had caught him off balance, and the implication of the unguarded reply was scarcely to be escaped. If the lichen had turned out not to be antibiotic, then what had it turned out to be? And why should Francis wish to conceal it? In the early stages of her investigation of the lichen, Diana had one advantage over Francis. She was not working under the impression that she was dealing with an antibiotic. She knew only that she was seeking something which had one property that looked antibiotic, but was not. In spite of this, however, she all but rejected the very thing she was looking for as too improbable. For good order, it deserved a further test, and then another, and another. The work became a challenge to Diana. It took almost all her spare time, and she frequently worked late into the evenings. Zephany, who had been sent off to boarding school, was disappointed to see little of her during the holidays. Diana's experiments were conducted mostly upon mice, and by the late autumn, more than a year after Caroline Saxover's death, she was beginning to have real confidence in her results. In the meantime, she had discovered the group of animals that Francis had been using for tests, and it was encouraging to be able to keep an eye on them too. In the early stages of the work, she had occasionally speculated on Francis's attitude and wondered what he intended to do with his findings. Now she started to give the matter her full attention. Uneasily, she realized that his work must have been 6 months ahead of hers. He must have been perfectly sure of his findings, yet there had been no whisper of them. As far as she could tell, he had done all the work on it himself and kept the results entirely to himself. It might be that he had negotiations for its large-scale production, but somehow she thought not. Even at that stage, she was half aware that it was too big a matter to be handled in the usual way. She felt troubled, too, by her ethical position, which looked more than a little moot. Not the legal position. There she was, fairly and squarely in the wrong. Under the usual clause in her contract, any discovery made by her while in the employ of Dar House Developments became the property of Dar House. Legally, she was aware, she should have handed the whole thing over to Francis, but ethically, well, if she had not dropped the lichen in the milk, there would have been no discovery. If Francis had not brought in the saucer, the effect might never have been noticed. She had not stolen Francis's work in any way. Really, you could say she had been prompted by curiosity into observing a phenomenon that she herself had noted. She had worked hard on it and arrived under her own steam. It struck her as pretty grim to have to let it all go. So she would simply wait and see what Francis's intentions were. Waiting gave more time for thinking, and thinking gave more grounds for uneasiness. She began to appreciate that this was not just another interesting discovery, and that they were, in fact, holding one of the most valuable and explosive secrets in the world. And Francis Saxover did not know what to do with it. Years later, Diana said, "I should have gone to him and told him what I'd done. At the very least, it would have given him someone to talk to, and that might have helped him to decide how to deal with it. But he was a famous man. He was my boss. And worst of all, I was shocked." The consequence of this shock was a hardening of her resolution. She would not even contemplate letting Francis know anything about her own work on the lichen. He could commit the crime of suppressing knowledge and have it on his conscience, but she was not going to be an accessory. She went on pondering the problem through the winter, but when the spring came, she was no nearer a solution. On her 25th birthday, she came into her inheritance from her grandfather's estate and was astonished to find herself well off. To her mother's amazement, she did not decide to leave Dar. "But why should I, Mummy? What should I do with myself?" "A woman ought to be married, darling. You're 25 now, and, well, time doesn't stand still. Life isn't very long. You see that plainly when you begin to look at it from the other end." "But there are so many families already," reasoned Diana. "Every woman wants a family at heart," said Mrs. Brackley. "It's only natural." "Habitual," corrected Diana. Mrs. Brackley frowned. "I don't understand you. Don't you want a house of your own and a family?" "Not furiously, Mummy. Perhaps I'll try it, though, later on. I've got plenty of time yet." "A woman is always up against time, and it doesn't do to forget it." "I'm sure you're right, Mummy, but don't you worry about me. I know what I'm doing." So, for the time being, Diana stayed at Dar. Zephany, coming home for the Easter holiday, complained that she was preoccupied. "You do think such an awful lot." "If you stop thinking, Zephany, you turn into advertiser's meat and end up as a housewife." "But most people do. Become housewives, I mean." "I know they do. And is that what you want?" "My great-aunt and other people's great-aunts won all the rights that women need ages ago. All that's been lacking is the courage to use them. What they didn't realise is that the greatest enemies of women aren't men at all. They're women. Silly women, lazy women, and smug women." Zephany regarded her thoughtfully. "I don't think you like women very much, Diana," she decided. "Too sweeping, darling. What I don't like about us is our readiness to be conditioned. I've been telling Miss Roberts, my history teacher, some of your theories about women being deluded into doing things." "And what did she say?"
She agreed. But she said, well, this is the kind of world we have to live in. There's so very much that's wrong, but then life is so short that the best anyone can do is to come to terms with it, while doing her best to preserve her own standards. She said it would be different if we had more time to spare. Diana, what on earth's the matter?
Diana did not reply. She sat staring straight before her, as if mesmerised.
Diana, aren't you well?
Diana turned her head slowly, not really seeing Zephany. "That's it," she said. "My God, that's it."
Diana, what is it? What's wrong?
"There's nothing wrong, Zephany, darling. Nothing at all. It's just that I've found out what I'm going to do."
What do you mean?
Zephany asked, bewildered. "I've found my career," Diana told her, in an odd voice, and then she began to laugh. The next day, Diana sought an interview with Francis and explained that she would like to leave at the end of August. Francis sighed and looked puzzled. "What have we done? Or are we not doing?"
I don't want to argue.
"But you must." The interview, which Diana had hoped would be brief, went on for some time. She explained that she'd come into some money and intended to take a trip round the world. He did not disapprove of that. "Good idea," he said. "Give you a chance to see for yourself how some of our tropical stuff really does in the field. Don't hurry it. Take a year off. Call it a sabbatical." "No," Diana said firmly, "that's not what I mean." "You don't want to come back here? I wish you would. We shall miss you, you know. I don't just mean professionally." Diana stood, uncertain, hesitating as if she were on a perilous brink. She began, choking. She went on facing him across the desk. He saw that she was trembling. "You must let me go, Francis. You must let me go." And she fled the room before he could reach her. "I'm glad you were both able to get away," Francis told his children.
I ought not to be here, but you did make it sound pretty urgent, said Paul.
"It is important, certainly, but just how urgent still seems to be in doubt. I hoped to know myself by now, but the fourth member of our quartet has been delayed. I doubt whether you'll remember her. She left Dar nearly 14 years ago. Diana Brackley is her name."
I think I remember, Paul told him. Tall, rather distinguished-looking. I certainly do very well, Zephany said. I had a pash for Diana. I used to think she was the most beautiful and, next to you, Daddy, the cleverest person in the world. Cried like anything when she went away.
"It was such a long time ago. What's this about?" asked Paul. Francis gazed critically at his son and daughter. Paul, 27 now and an engineer, still looked boyish in spite of his beard, while Zephany had grown up to be much prettier than expected. She had her mother's curling golden hair and dark hazel eyes. As she sat now in his study, she looked more like a girl about to leave school than a member of university engaged upon a postgraduate course. "You are most certainly going to think that this is something I should have told you before," he began. "Perhaps it is. But there seemed to be good reason against it. I hope you will see that."
"Oh, dear, this sounds terribly ominous, Daddy. Are we foundlings or something?"
Zephany asked. "No, you're certainly not. But it is rather a long story. It began in the July of the year your mother died." He gave them an account of the finding of the lichen speck in the saucer of milk, and went on, "I took the jar of lichen up to my lab to be looked at later, and soon after that your mother died. I went rather to pieces over it, I think. It's not at all clear now, but I remember waking up one morning and knowing quite suddenly that if I didn't get down to some work and lose myself in it, I should crack up altogether. So I went off to the lab and worked, and one of the things that I looked into was that lichen Diana had spotted. Lichens are queer things. For a long time there didn't seem to be any use for them. Then, comparatively recently, some of them were found to have antibiotic properties. Naturally, I thought that an antibiotic was what I was looking for. After a while, I had to recognize that it was not an antibiotic, and was gradually forced to admit that it was something quite different. Something there was no name for, so I had to invent one. I called it antigerone.
Meaning what?
Asked Zephany, forthright. Anti, against, gerone, age, or, more literally, old man. The effect of the lichen is straightforward. It retards the normal rate of metabolism throughout an organism. His son and daughter were silent while the implication sank. It was Zephany who spoke first.
Daddy, you don't mean you found... Oh, no, it can't be that.
It is, darling. And I'm afraid that in order to use it at all with safety, I had to resort to subterfuge. Perhaps this was unwise, perhaps not, but what is done, and it cannot be undone. Paul's eyes widened.
Our immunisation?
Francis nodded. Paul recalled a day soon after his 17th birthday when Francis had urged him to take advantage of a new immunising agent to be administered by himself. Later on, when Zephany was 16, Francis had done the same for her. Zephany crossed to a wall mirror and stood looking into it.
"How long?"
she said. Francis did not reply. He might not have heard her. His gaze left her and travelled across the wall to the portrait of his wife. Zephany turned round fiercely. The tension in her body hardened her voice.
"I asked you how long," she said. "How long am I going to live?"
Francis looked back. Their eyes held for a long moment, then his dropped. "I estimate your expectation of life, my dear, at approximately 220 years. In the pause that followed, there was a knock at the door. Miss Burchett, Francis's secretary, put her head in.
"Miss Brackley on the line from London. She says it's important."
Francis nodded and followed her out of the room.
"Did he really mean that?" Paul exclaimed. "Oh, Paul, can you imagine Daddy saying a thing like that if he didn't mean it?"
"No, I suppose not. How did you get onto it so fast? All he said was—" Paul broke off as the door opened and Francis returned. "Diana won't be coming down after all. The emergency is over, she says."
"What emergency?"
asked Zephany. "I'm not altogether clear about that yet, except that she thought there might be publicity and that she ought to warn me."
"But I don't understand. Where does Diana come into it? Is she acting as your agent?"
Zephany wanted to know. Francis shook his head. "She is not my agent. Until a couple of days ago, I'd no idea that anybody but me knew anything about it. However, she made it quite clear that she does, and has done for some time."
"Do you mean she's stolen your work?"
asked Paul. "No. She says she worked it out for herself. I'm willing to believe that. As I understand it, she has been using the lichen. Something went wrong, and now she's being sued for damages. She's afraid that unless she can keep it out of court, the whole thing may be shown in evidence."
"She's been giving this stuff to people without their knowing," said Zephany.
"Yes. She, like I, had to resort to subterfuge in order to use it at all with any degree of safety."
"That's all very well, Daddy," replied Zephany. "We're us and you're you, so it wasn't very difficult, really, but it would be quite different for her. What is this firm of Diana's?"
"Something odd. Egyptian. Nefertiti Limited, I think."
"Good heavens!" exclaimed Zephany, laughing. "That just happens to be the beauty place in London. terribly expensive and exclusive."
The implication did not reach Francis at once, but as it sank in, a series of emotions began to conflict in his expression. He stared back at his daughter, bereft of speech, then his eyes unfocused. He leant suddenly forward, put his head in his hands, and began to laugh with a queer, jerky sobbing. Zephany crossed to the cupboard and poured some brandy into a glass. Francis took it and drank half the contents at a gulp. Gradually, his eyes lost that empty look. "Sorry," he said, "but it is funny, isn't it? All these years a secret. Greatest discovery in centuries. Now, a beauty treatment. Don't you think it's funny?" He lifted his eyes to his wife's portrait, raised his glass, and wept. After an hour and a half, Francis, quite restored, resumed his disquisition. "As I told you," he began, "I take little credit for finding Lichen. It started from an accident, and Diana appears to have taken advantage of the same accident. The difficult part began when I realized what it was that I'd found. I had no idea how to deal with it myself, and the more I thought about it, the more alarmed I felt. Just imagine the result of a public announcement. One of the great wish dreams of mankind come true. The contriving, the bribery, the chaos that would follow in a world which is already overpopulated. The prospect gave me nightmares, and still does. But that's not the worst of it. The basic trouble with lichen is that it is derived from a particular species of lichen that was sent to us by a roving botanist, and it exists in colonies which, as far as he knows, are restricted to a few square miles of territory. In other words, there is precious little of it. So you can see what would happen. You announce the discovery, and then qualify it by saying that only so many, 3,000 or 4,000 I'd say, can be treated. Well, my goodness, it's a matter of life and death. Who are going to be the lucky ones, and why? If anyone was entitled to the benefit of your father's discovery, surely it was you two. Now I realized that was bound to be self-defeating. There would be a time when you would notice it and start putting two and two together. So there it is. I've done my best, and that hasn't been good enough. It can't be very long now until someone says, "Strange how those Saxovers look so young for their ages." One day it'll start as simply as that. All the same, it is best for everybody that it should be kept quiet as long as possible. Something may yet turn up to make the crisis less critical. Paul sat forward in his chair. "That's all very well," he put in. "Things may be the same for you, but they aren't for me. I have a wife, and she has a right to know too." Francis raised his eyes to meet his son's. "If you are willing to risk responsibility for a disaster on a scale as yet unimagined, you will go ahead and do what seems to you the gentlemanly thing. But if you are wise, you will tell no one. No one at all." Zephany stepped out of the lift, fumbling for the keys to her flat. A large figure rose from a severe-looking chair in the landing and confronted her as she approached her door. "Oh, dear," she said. "Oh, dear, indeed," replied the young man grimly. "You're late by more than an hour." "I'm terribly sorry, Richard. It went out of my mind." "Indeed," Richard Treverne said. He stood there, a tall, burly young man, somewhat mollified by the genuineness of her confusion. She put her hand to his lapel. "Please don't be angry. I couldn't help it. Come in and sit down." He grunted and followed her in. After this poorish start, the evening did not recover well, and so Zephany tried artificial aid to lighten the mood. 4 martinis, a bottle of wine, a double brandy. She soon became weepy and demanded more brandy. "Now then," said Richard, gently deflecting the request, "what's all this about? What's the trouble?" She clung to his hand, and the tears trickled down. "I'm frightened, Richard. I don't want it." "You don't want what?" he asked. "Just think of it, Richard. Everybody getting old and
tired and dying, and just me going on and on and on, all alone. I'm frightened, Richard. I want to die like other people. Love and live and grow old and die. That's all I want.
That's enough of this nonsense, Zeph. It's time you packed it in and went to bed. But tell me, who did this? Who upset you so?
Daddy. But he meant it for the best, she added loyally. But 200 years is too much, on and on and on, I think. Such a long way to go all alone. 200 years...
She stopped abruptly, looking at Richard wide-eyed.
Oh, dear. I shouldn't have said that. Oh, you must forget it, Richard. It's a secret, a most important secret.
Richard regarded her for a moment, and then smiled. All right, Zeph, dear. It's safe with me. Now, you get along to bed. With that, he picked her up, carried her to the bedroom, and laid her on the bed. Leaving the door of her room a little ajar, he went back to the sitting room and, deep in thought, lit a cigarette. After a while, he closed her door softly, collected his hat and coat, and let himself out of the flat. Telling his wife turned out to be less simple than Paul had thought. To start with, he had forgotten that he and Jane were invited to a cocktail party by which she set some store. His late arrival home was met with chilly reproof, while his suggestion that they should skip the party was curtly rejected. Then the party itself, with the unsatisfying support of something called a fork supper, lasted all evening. So he decided to wait until they were in bed. But Jane snuggled down with the air of one determined to go to sleep. Paul turned out the light, the revelation postponed. Though Jane was not exactly what Francis would have wished for his son, and it could scarcely fail to occur to him that the Saxover prospects had played some part in her attraction, he recalled earlier possibilities that would have pleased him less, and so he put a good face on it. As well as looks, Jane had assurance. Her social instincts were well developed, her sense of taboo was reliable, and she had a proper respect for all of the commandments that were currently in good standing. Nevertheless, Paul was right in thinking that neither his father nor his sister liked Jane. Both had tried. Francis was prepared to go on trying, but Zephany had given up and had followed a course of measured disengagement from her sister-in-law's society, which suited both parties. And that, Paul thought as he reconsidered his approach the next morning, wasn't going to make Jane's reception of the news any kinder. In the end, he decided in favour of the direct move. Over his second cup of coffee, he came straight at it. There is no conventional reply provided for a young woman whose husband tells her across the breakfast table, and in a rather explosive way, that he expects to live for 200 years.
Well, she said, expectation of life has increased a lot in the last 50 years.
It is frustrating to have one's dramatic swipe parried by a cushion. Paul responded irritably. Good God, the banality of women!
But, Paul, you can't expect me to believe this. It's fantastic. You must be joking.
Paul's fingers tensed. He glared at her in a quite alarming way and then relaxed. Evidently they were right, he said. I'd have done better not to mention it.
Who were right?
Why, Father and Zephany, of course.
You mean to say they told you not to tell me?
They did. But what's it matter? It's all a joke. You said so.
You mean it isn't a joke?
Oh, for goodness sake! A joke is meant to be humorous. If you can find anything humorous about this, I'd like to hear it. Jane's eyes dwelt on him thoughtfully.
This is worth millions, millions of millions, she exclaimed, eyes glinting.
Paul looked at his wife uneasily. If my father wanted to be fabulously rich, Dar wouldn't be run as he runs it. In fact, it wouldn't exist. His overriding interest is his work. It always has been. It's the consequences that are worrying him. You must know him better than that.
Every man has his price, Jane began.
I dare say, but it isn't always money.
If it isn't, it's power. And enough money is infinite power, said Jane.
He's not a megalomaniac, replied Paul. He's a very worried man.
That may be, but I have every intention of talking with him, and believe me, I have a lot to say.
I'd like to have a go at it. There's something there worth looking into, said Gerald Marlin, journalist at large. It's a big outfit, Nefertiti. Gotta be damn sure of your footholds, responded the editor of the Sunday Prole. Well, naturally, but just the kind of outfit our readers would enjoy seeing socked. High-class luxury scandal stuff. Said the editor dubiously. Look, Bill, this Wilbury woman has shaken him down for 5,000. 5,000! And she'd have been lucky to get 500 if she'd gone to court. There's something fishy going on here, mark my words. The editor pondered. You may have something, he said. There's something about this Brackley woman who runs it. Real brains, apparently, and not just the usual business cunning. I've got some preliminary dope on her. Father deceased. No marriages as far as known yet. Lives costly but not flashy. Business reputation exemplary clean. All staff carefully vetted. No smudged characters accepted. No love life. At least none current. But research proceeds. Said the editor. No very human figure emerges, does it? Gerald shook his head. His editor continued to muse, then nodded. All right, Jerry boy, you look into it, but go canny. This Nefertiti outfit packs a lot of high-powered feminine punch, so just bear that in mind, will you? The room was stark by modern standards, but it was an expensive, tasteful kind of starkness, and not unpleasing. Zephany walked over to the window. Beyond it, accessible by a glass door, some square yards of roof were laid out as a small garden. Dwarf tulips were in bloom in several beds. On a bank, in the shade of carefully clipped bushes, violets grew. Gosh, said Zephany, in honest envy. At the sound of the door opening, she turned. Diana stood there in a simple, beautifully cut grey silk suit. For some moments they looked at one another without speaking. Diana was almost exactly as Zephany remembered her. She must, she knew, be very nearly 40 now. She looked 28, no more. Zephany smiled with a touch of uncertainty. This makes me feel like a little girl again, she said. Diana smiled back. They went on looking at each other. It is true. It really does work, Zephany murmured, half to herself. You only have to look in the mirror, said Diana. She put one arm around Zephany. It's been a bit of a shock, I suspect, she said. Zephany nodded. It was rather at first. I felt so terribly alone with it. I'm getting over that now. I thought it would be best to meet here and talk, but we'll come to that. First, I want to hear what's been happening to you, and to your father, and about Dar, too. They talked. Diana gradually smoothed away Zephany's nervousness and the sense of unreality that had been overhanging her. By the time luncheon was over, she felt more at ease than she had any time since Francis had sprung his news. Back in the sitting room, however, Diana steered round to the reason for her call. Well, now, What do you want me to do, my dear?
You've done some of it already. You've reassured me. But I do want to understand what's going on. I'm in such a muddle. Here's Daddy made a discovery that's going to ring down the ages, and instead of being acclaimed as a wonderful discoverer, he's gone all hole in corner. I don't understand. I know Daddy says there isn't enough of the lichen to do much with, but why not give people the incentive to find another Antigerone? And where do you come into all this with Nefertiti and the crisis that blew up and then disappeared?
Half knowledge is precarious, so I'd better start at the beginning, said Diana. She lit a cigarette and started from the time Francis brought in the saucer of milk and the consequences. Legally, she concluded, I'm in the wrong, though morally I've just as much right to it as your father. But the point where both of us got stuck was the handling of it. It took me some time to realise how stuck I was. I couldn't see a way of dealing with it at all. And then something you said suddenly put me on the track. Something I said? Zephany repeated. Yes. We were talking about women being diddled, remember? Said Diana. You said that you'd mentioned it to one of your teachers, and she'd said we must do our best to live in the circumstances we found, because life was too short for us to put the world to rights. Well, what we've found, your father and I, is a step in evolution, a kind of synthetic evolution, and the only evolutionary advance by man in 1,000,000 years. What was necessary was somehow to collect a group of people, any group of people, convince them that extended life was practicable, and make them fight for the acceptance of Homo superior. And I saw how to do it. People who have been given long life are not going to renounce it. They're going to fight hard for their right to retain it. Zephany frowned. I don't think I follow, she said. You should. You feel confused and upset right now, but you wouldn't renounce longer life, would you? You'd maintain your right to it if anyone wanted to take it away, wouldn't you? Yes, I suppose so. But there's the shortage of supply. Oh, research will soon clear that up. According to Daddy, there'll be a state of chaos. Of course there will be chaos. We shan't get Homo superior without birth pangs. But that's not important. What is important is to stop him from getting strangled at birth. I don't see that happening. Once it's known, people will be fighting to have longer lives, said Zephany. You're talking about individuals, and individuals are subject to institutions. Institutions are a product of circumstance. They are designed to survive our own limitations by the continual replacement of worn-out parts. The crux of the whole thing is, as I see it, that institutions will very definitely not want it. Think, is anybody going to welcome the thought of the same managing director, president, judge, ruler, pope and police chief going on for a couple of centuries? Or take education. The sort of smattering that's been good enough to tide most of us over 50 years isn't going to give us a full life for 200 or more. So what we'll have is individual man in a life-and-death struggle with institutional man. Zephany turned towards the window. For some moments she watched the small sunlit clouds drifting in a blue sky. I thought I was beginning to understand this discovery. But Daddy thinks people will be fighting one another for it, and you think people will be fighting one another to stop it. So what's the use? If it isn't going to bring anything but fighting and wretchedness, then it would be better if neither of you had ever found it. Diana looked at her thoughtfully. You don't mean that, my dear. You know, as well as I do, that the world is in a mess and floundering deeper every day. Look at us, thousands more of us every day. In a century or so, we shall be in the age of famines. We shall manage to postpone the worst, one way or another, but postponement isn't solution. And when the breakdown comes, there'll be something so ghastly that the hydrogen bomb will seem humane by comparison. I'm talking about the inevitable time when men will be hunting men through the ruins for food. We're letting it drift towards that with an evil irresponsibility, because, with our ordinary short lives, we shan't be here to see it. Does our generation care about the misery it is bequeathing? There's only one thing I can see that will stop it happening, and that is that some of us should live long enough to be afraid for ourselves. We need the time to acquire wisdom that we can use to clear up the mess. If we don't get it, then, like any other animal that overbreeds, we shall starve. We shall starve in our millions, in the blackest of dark ages. Zephany made no reply for several minutes. Then she said, "Is this the way you saw it all that time ago when you were at Dar?" "No. This is how I've come to see it. In those days, I saw it as a gift. What was important was to build up a body of people, long livers without their knowing it, who would have a vested interest in fighting for it, and some influence when the time comes." She gave a little smile. "I know the way I did it can look funny. To your father, I'm sure it's outrageous. But I still can't think of any other way I could have managed it successfully. I've got them, you see. Almost 1,000 women, nearly all of them married to or related to people of influence. Once they understand the situation, I shall be extremely sorry for anyone who tries to legislate them out of their extra years of life." "How did you do it?" asked Zephany. "Once I had decided it could be done, the first thing was to make sure of my resources. I had to be certain of a steady supply of what your father calls lichen. So I announced I was going on a round-the-world trip for a year. First I went to Hong Kong and made contact with your father's shipping agent there. He put me on to several people who could supply me with the know-how. The stuff comes from Hokkien, a province of Manchuria, north of Vladivostok. I was able to commission the locals for an annual collection of a standard quantity, but the lichen is so slow-growing there can't be much of a margin. Unfortunately, there doesn't seem to be any reliable way of finding out just how it's holding up, short of going there, and we can't hope to increase the supply much unless we find some other sites or discover some other species which will also yield lichen. In fact, I never did like the supply position at all. It's worked out all right so far, but any trouble in those parts might cut it off entirely. What's more, not only is the stuff under Chinese control, but the Russian frontier is no more than 200 miles away. If the Russians were to take an interest in it, well... I tell you this because I think someone ought to know. It's vitally important the source shouldn't be made public, but it's just about as important that knowledge of it shouldn't be lost. I have a feeling that the thing cannot be kept quiet much longer, and when it does come out, the real source of the lichen is one thing that must not, in any circumstances, be made public. In fact, I've laid my own red herring trail, and I would appreciate it if you would not mention the source to your father." Zephany did not respond. She remained sunk in thought, blankly staring at a painting on the wall. Then she turned and looked at Diana. "I wish you'd not told me that, about the source of the lichen. I'm not to be trusted," Zephany told her, and explained about Richard. Diana considered her thoughtfully. "You'd had a shock. I don't think it's likely to happen a second time. Did he believe it, or did he just think you were being drunk and silly?" "I'm not sure. He must know there was something in it." Diana considered again. "This young man, Richard, what sort of man is he? Brains or beef?" "Both." "Fortunate young man. Do you trust him?" "I'm going to marry him," Zephany said sharply. "That's no answer. Women are constantly marrying men they don't trust. What's his job?" "He's a lawyer." "He ought to have some idea of discretion, then. If you have confidence in him, take him down to see your father and have it out." "Agreed," said Zephany. "Now I want to know a bit more about you. What happened at Nefertiti?" "Well, until now we've managed wonderfully smoothly. The only thing that has really caused me anxiety is these wretched women who won't tell us soon enough that they're going to have babies, so that one can knock them off the lichen injections in time. But so far it's been absolutely fine, until Mrs. Wilbury and her damned allergy. That was bad luck. Genuine enough, poor thing. She swelled up quite alarmingly, vivid rash all over, asthmatic congestion. There's no doubt she had a nasty time of it, but she'd have settled for a few hundreds if her lawyer hadn't worked on her. The man's stuck like a mule on 5,000, which is going to be quite trying enough when the news gets around. Diana gloomed for some moments, but then threw the mood off. "Perhaps we'll weather it yet," she said, "and if we don't, well, there can't be so much longer to run now." Paul's secretary caught him as he was on the point of leaving the office. "Dr. Saxover's on the telephone, sir." He turned back and picked up the receiver. "That you, Paul?" Francis asked, without warmth. "Yes, Father." "I had a visit from your wife this morning, Paul. I think you might have at least had the courtesy to tell me you had informed her." "I did tell you, Father. I explained my position." "When did you tell her?" "The next morning," said Paul. 5 days ago, Did she say anything about coming to see me?" "Well, yes, she did, but I wasn't sure if she meant it. We said some rather heated things at the time. What did she want?" "Really, Paul, what do you think she wanted? Or rather, demanded?" "And did you—" "Yes. I thought you'd better know." There was a click on the receiver as the other end went down. Jane was not in when Paul got home. It was past 9 o'clock when she arrived. Paul, his third whisky beside him, looked at her with an unamiable expression that she did not bother to notice. "I've been down to Dar," she said, with an air of getting it in first. "So I've heard." "And?" "Why didn't you tell me you were going? I could have warned him to expect you." "I didn't want him warned. Why should he have time to think up more reasons for keeping me out of it, leaving me with a short life while the rest of you have long ones? I knew what I meant to get, and I got it." "So I gathered." "I don't suppose he liked it. And how do you suppose I've liked his deliberately excluding me?" "It wasn't deliberate. Not in the way that you mean. Won't you understand that he's got to be careful? He's got to take every precaution against it leaking out. He's thinking of the disorganisation that will follow any hint of it." "Why are you looking at me like that? This isn't funny, Jane. It's very far from funny." "I think it is. Naivety is, you know. And a little touching. Bless the boy. I think you really do believe anything your eminent father tells you. Isn't it about time you grew up, my pet? It didn't even occur to you to inquire who this Diana Brackley is and what she's doing. You never realised that she's been acting as the outlet for this stuff for years. She simply runs an uncannily successful beauty business, and a very nice thing they must have been making out of it between them for years." Paul went on staring at her. "I don't believe it. God knows what speculations your inquiries about Diana may have stirred up. You've made inquiries of someone, and your married name does happen to be Saxover. I'd better ring him." "What for?" asked Jane. "I've told you what happened. He did as I demanded." "You mean you think he did? It would be easy to substitute—" He broke off, disconcerted by the way she was staring at him. He reached a hand towards her. She pulled back into her chair. Paul paused, looking down on her curiously. "What are you afraid of? Have you been lying about this, Jane? Wasn't there an implantation at all?" "Of course there was." "Then I'd like to see." He made a quick snatch and pulled her sleeve up to show a neat white bandage round her upper arm. He shook his head. "I know very well how my father dresses the wound afterwards. That's not his way of doing it." "No," she agreed. "The blood soaked through. I had to put on a new one." "And you managed that neat dressing single-handed? How clever of you. I've had about enough of this. What have you been up to? What is it you're trying to hide?" Jane attempted to capture her earlier manner, but it was a poor imitation. She'd never known him to look at her with the expression he wore now, and her confidence in her ability to manage him was wilting. "Hide?" she said unconvincingly. "I don't know what you mean. I've just told you." "I want to know what else you've been up to, and I intend to find out." Up on the 5th floor of the deliberately unostentatious building off Curzon Street, where Nefertiti Limited carried out its mission, the communicator on Diana's desk buzzed into life.
"I have a Miss Brendan here from the 2nd floor. She's very anxious to see you."
Very well," said Diana. And Miss Brendan was ushered in. She was small, pretty and golden-haired, somewhat doll-like, until you noticed the set of her chin, the line of her mouth, and the still lingering light of battle in her blue eyes. Diana studied her, and she, with equal candour, studied Diana. "Well now, what is it?"
"I went to a party last night, Miss Brackley. Just a meal and then dancing in a club. There were 6 of us. The only one I knew was the man who invited me. While we were eating, they started talking about Miss Wilbury and what could have caused her allergy. My friend said I worked at Nefertiti and so I ought to know. Of course I said I didn't know because I don't. But this other man kept talking about it, and I began to have a feeling that the whole thing hadn't come up by accident. In the end, he invited me to come out with him tomorrow night, and I said I'd let him know. I've made some inquiries about him. He's a journalist called Marlin. He works for the Sunday Prole."
Diana nodded thoughtfully, her eyes on the girl's face. "I take it you've not mentioned it to anyone else?"
"No, Miss Brackley."
"Good. Well now, I think the best thing, if you've no objection, is for you to meet this Mr. Marlin tomorrow evening and tell him the sort of thing he wants to know. If you don't talk to this Mr. Marlin, the poor man is going to be put to all the trouble of contriving a contact with some other member of staff, and I'd much prefer to know what he's being told. Now, how, I wonder, can we steer him unobtrusively onto a second contact?" "Is that all?" inquired Richard. He looked down at the bandage on his left arm and fingered it gently. "Quite undramatic, I'm afraid. The films do this sort of thing much better," Francis told him. "This will dissolve very slowly and be absorbed into the system. One could use injections. In fact, I did use them myself at first, but it's a nuisance, and less satisfactory, too. It gives a series of jolts, whereas this is smooth and steady." Richard glanced at the bandage again. "It's still difficult to believe. I don't really know what to say, sir." "Don't try." Richard looked at him in surprise, and then, not unkindly, Francis continued, "It's a devious world, my boy. Keep this entirely to yourself. Our competitors are interested in finding out what they can about us. A few of them are none too scrupulous. They would not hesitate to use any means to their end. Incidentally, I should take particular care not to let Mr. Farrier get any inkling of this." "Tom Farrier? But he's an advertising man. I knew him at school." "I dare say. But you've only recently come across him again and introduced him to Zephany, haven't you? Did you know that his mother remarried, and her husband happens to be the head research man with Chemicultures Limited? No, I see you didn't. Well, as I said, it's a devious world."
"Hello, Richard,"
Zephany said as they entered the sitting room.
"Itches, doesn't it?"
Richard nodded unhappily. "Well now, if you'll both excuse me, there are some things I must see to before dinner," Francis said, and took himself off. Zephany turned to Richard earnestly and took his hand.
10 days ago, I was happy at the thought of spending 50 years with you, Richard, if we should be lucky. Now, I just don't know. Can one spend 150 years, 200 perhaps, with somebody? Can 2 people go on loving one another that long? What happens? How much does one change in all that time?"
Richard put his arm around her. "Darling, we couldn't know our future 10 days ago. We still can't know it now. Only that we shall probably have more of it than we expected. So why not start off just as we should have done, for better or for worse? That's what I still want to do. This isn't to be worried about, it's to be lived. It's going to be an adventure. We're going to enjoy finding out about it together. Aren't we?" Zephany let the troubled look clear.
"Oh, yes, Richard, darling. Of course we are."
Dominating the sparse Monday Morning Post beside Francis Saxover's breakfast plate was a slightly bulging envelope addressed to him in a dashing hand. He opened it to find that though most of the content was newspaper, there was also a brief covering letter. Dear Francis, I suspect that the enclosed may not have reached your attention and feel that you should be acquainted with their contents. An explanation. One of the red herrings in my defence system has now taken wing and is likely to prove a credit to its stable. Yours in haste, Diana Brackley. Puzzled, Francis picked up the paper marked A. It revealed itself as a complete page from the Sunday Radar. The article explained that radar investigators had uncovered the secret of preserving beauty used in Nefertiti, and that far from costing £300 a year, it could easily be covered by 300 pence. It proposed to share this discovery with its readers in a series of exclusive articles. Francis, with a feeling of having been given the minimum amount of information possible, laid the sheet aside, wondering how many weekly articles the Radar would be able to shell off before it arrived at the point. He then picked up the other cutting, a more modest affair, in the form of a double-column panel from the Sunday Prole by Gerald Marlin, whose piece began, "It has been no secret around Mayfair this week that a certain beauty establishment, whose name is a household word, provided it is an upper-income bracket household, settled for damages on a lavish scale rather than expose its workings to vulgar notice in the law courts, and rather, perhaps, than have to answer pertinent questions in public. So silken skirts have been drawn aside from contamination and privacy has been preserved, at a price." Francis Saxover, growing a little tired of Mr. Marlin's turgid style of innuendo, skipped until he came to the last paragraph. "The source of one sensitive client's allergy remains unknown even to herself, so out of sympathy with her plight, may we offer her the following advice. Let her avoid, if possible, the shores of Galway Bay and a certain type of seaweed to be found there. Provided she takes this simple precaution, she should be able to enjoy her generous compensation with an easy mind." After he had finished breakfast, Francis broke his usual habit of going straight up to his laboratory and made his way to the study to make a telephone call. "Thank you for the newspaper cuttings, Diana," he said. "You're welcome. There's going to be no end of fun over this." "Look here," said Francis. "I regret having to strike a sour note at this stage, but I fear I must. I don't think I'd better tell you now, but I'm coming up to London today, and I think we ought to meet." "Good. I'm looking forward to seeing you again after all this time, Francis. But tell me, is it so very serious?" "Yes, Diana. I'm afraid it is," he said. Diana moved aside the fat red candle which stood between them. By its light they studied one another. Diana went on looking without speaking. She became aware that her hand was trembling and hid it from sight. With an effort she asked, "How angry are you with me, Francis?" He shook his head. "I'm not angry. I have no right to be. But alarmed, that I am. Did you hear the 6 o'clock news? The Ministry of Agriculture has published an order forbidding the export of seaweed. Just what do you expect this seaweed nonsense to do?" "Provide a diversion," Diana told him. "My competitors are a fairly credulous lot. It'll take quite a time before they become really convinced that there's nothing in it. In the meantime, customers will be clamouring for seaweed cream, seaweed breakfast, and so on and so forth. You needn't fear that the true source will come out for a long time yet." Francis shook his head slowly. Ingenious, he admitted. But I'm very much afraid it's all wasted, Diana.
Oh, no, she exclaimed. Francis, what's happened?
Francis looked around the room again. He did not recognize any of the other diners, and there was enough general sound in the room to cover ordinary conversation. He leaned in and spoke. It isn't pleasant to have to admit, but in the circumstances, it could possibly be dangerous for you if I were not frank. It involves my daughter-in-law. Zephany told me about her, so Paul did decide to tell her. Yes, he considered it his duty. It was not, I gather, an entirely amicable occasion. They were both a little rattled, with the unfortunate result that he can't recall just how much he told her, but he did mention the lichen and he did mention you. Diana's fingers clenched. That, she said, would scarcely seem to be necessary. The whole damn thing was unnecessary. But apparently once he'd begun, he felt he had to account for my decision to tell him and Zephany about it, and Jane did not take it at all well. He gave her an account of Jane's visit. Diana frowned. In other words, she staged a hold-up. Not a very nice young woman. You gave her the lichen. Francis nodded. It would have been easy enough to fob her off for the time being, but there seemed little to gain by that. The serious damage, I thought, had been done already, so I gave it to her. I gather you use injection, but I implanted, as I do with Paul and Zephany, a soluble tablet. I wish to God I'd had the sense to make it an injection. I don't see how that would have made any difference. When she got home, she told Paul she'd been to see me, and when he saw the dressing, he knew at a glance that it was not done my way. He'd already got suspicious, something in her manner, I suppose. He insisted on examining the incision, and, well, the lichen implant was not there. Paul spent the night in the spare room. When he woke up in the morning, she'd already gone. Nobody's seen her since.
She got it from you in order to take it to somebody else?
Clearly, said Francis.
How much could they learn from the tablet?
A lot less than they think, I imagine. Neither you nor I have been able to synthesize it in all this time, but we'd better assume she's told them all she knows.
Does she know where it comes from?
Asked Diana. No, fortunately I didn't tell Paul that. What do you suppose will be their next step? Look into our imports and try to trace something from those, I should imagine. Diana smiled. If they are able to find their way through that part of my defences in less than a year or two, I shall be astonished. And as for Dar, you're continually getting parcels of queer stuff from all over the world. But not a great deal of lichen, unfortunately, Francis said. Naturally, I was careful and took precaution against accidents, but an intensive investigation is rather a different matter. It had to come, Diana. One's always known it must, sooner or later.
Oh, Francis, she said, this is so damn silly and petty. All we want to do is give people something, to make an old dream come true. We can offer them time to grow wise enough to build a new world, time to become full men and women instead of overgrown children. It has gone on too long, Francis. We can't hold it any longer. Will you publish?
Not yet, Francis told her.
I warn you, I shall begin to prepare my ladies.
You might as well, he agreed. That is different from making a scientific announcement that one knows cannot be implemented.
It will be implemented if they demand it loudly enough.
Diana paused as she passed through the outer office on her way to her own.
Good morning, Sarah. Is there anything special today? Not in the mail, Miss Brackley, but there's this. I don't suppose you'll have seen it yet.
She held open a copy of the Reflector magazine. Beauty, it announced, beauty that lasts. From the sea, the great mother of all living things, we bring you new, deeper beauty. Glamour, Glamour is glamour fetched from the sea to your own dressing table. Ah, said Diana, and only a month from the starting pistol. Not at all bad going. Well now, anything else?
Miss Brendan would like to see you.
Tell her to come up as soon as she's free.
And Lady Tuley wishes to make an appointment.
Diana nodded and went on into her office. After a quarter of an hour, Miss Brendan was shown in. Good morning, Lucy. Do sit down. How is the Brendan Secret Service going? Miss Brendan frowned a little.
So many people seem to be interested, she said.
There's the man Marlin from the Prole. Well, he cropped up again and has offered me £50 if I can get him a specimen of the actual seaweed we use. Go on. The police are interested. There's been an inspector asking questions about us and making inquiries from that allergy woman. The Prole and the police. Who else? Several other girls have acquired new boyfriends, some of whom are definitely connected with cosmetics firms. Others maybe too, but no details as yet. What a hive of curiosity we are, said Diana.
If there's nothing else, began Lucy.
There is. Something important. The time is coming when I shall need someone close to me whom I can trust. I'm going to make you an offer. I know quite a lot about you, more probably than you imagine. Now, I want to tell you some things that no one here knows about, no one but me. And then I'm going to make you a proposition. At 3 o'clock, the door to Diana's office opened, and in stepped Lady Tuley, a tall, slim, elegant woman in a soft leather suit of a delicate grey. Everything, from the points of her shoes to the crown of her small hat, was carefully considered, and she did credit to all her producers, including Nefertiti Limited. She sat down gracefully and leant back a little. They looked at one another. Janet Tuley chuckled. I know what you're thinking, Diana, and it's very flattering of you to look so smug about it. Diana smiled. She had indeed been thinking of their first meeting 10 years ago. The Lady Tuley who had looked at her across this same desk then had been very different. A tall, nervous girl of 22 with good looks, a lovely figure and limbs, no idea of dress, an unsuitable hairstyle, and a disposition to gangle like a 16-year-old. She had looked confused. I'm sorry, she'd said, but I've never been in a place like this before. I had an idea it would be run by someone like a toughened-up Queen Victoria. Well, I'm glad to be a weight off your mind. Now, what do you want me to do? A sort of Pygmalion thing. You see, I've taken on the job of being Lady Tuley, and it's only fair that I should try to do it properly. It isn't the kind of thing I ever expected, so I need help. Diana told her frankly, I can recommend you good guides and tutors. How much you learn from them is your own affair. I can learn. What I need now is a good grounding in the grammar of it. And if I can't soon beat some of these nitwits at their own game, then I'll deserve what I get. Diana nodded slowly. I understand you, she said, but you mustn't underestimate them. They're on their own territory, after all. It's one thing to do your job, but you're not doing it well if you break your own heart. I shan't. I've no ambition to climb. But I took this on, and it's up to me to be an asset and not a liability. She spoke with a touch of bitterness, Diana noticed. What were you doing before this? She asked. I was a fourth-year medical student living in a bedsit in Bloomsbury. I knew the requirements there. I didn't know these would turn out to be quite so different. Well, I see no reason why you should not make a success of this. In fact, I'm sure you can if you set your mind to it, said Diana, and they had gone ahead. Seeing the impeccably dressed, carefully mannered and assured Lady Tuley before her now, she smiled a little at the recollection. I imagine you'll want to know what I came about, said Janet. Diana nodded. I'm afraid it isn't very pleasant. I take it you won't have heard about my affair with a Mr. Smelton yet. Diana shook her head. Janet rummaged in the bag that exactly matched her suit. Presently she produced a flexible gold bracelet set with diamonds and placed it on Diana's desk, where it twinkled lustrously. Nice, isn't it? Horace Smelton gave it to me for my birthday. The funny thing is that, although it was Horace who gave it to me, it was my husband who bought it. I just happened to find that out. And it was my husband who introduced Horace to me about a couple of months ago. My husband and I have been on formal terms for nearly 3 years now. We put up a show in public, but that's about all. So what, I wondered, was going on? To cut it short, I noticed that Nefertiti seemed to be cropping up in our conversations now and then. Oh, Horace is quite subtle. He didn't immediately say that the stuff about seaweed was sheer eyewash. He let that come later. In due course, we got around to a proposition. If we could get hold of specimens, he knew of people who would be willing to give a good price for them. While I thought it over, I remembered that my husband has a very old friend who was a director of Sandworth Chemical Products Limited. Janet paused and shook her head. In fact, Diana, I have an impression that the jig is very nearly up. Diana looked at her steadily. What jig? My dear, said Janet, I've known you now for 10 years. And all that time, both of us have changed remarkably little. I did do 4 years of medicine, you remember. I know you, Diana, I trust you. And I am bursting with questions. Diana looked at her. Janet Tuley had accommodated her manner to her environment too successfully to display anything but grateful lassitude. Diana smiled and glanced at the clock. Very well, she agreed, but only half an hour now. The questions commenced for more than half an hour until they were interrupted by the telephone. It was Zephany. It's about Dar, Diana. Daddy thought it wiser not to ring you himself. What's happened? There's been a fire. The police are quite sure it was started deliberately. They think it very likely that there was an attempt at burglary and the fire was started afterwards to cover it up. Of course, it's impossible to know what they may have taken, but I'm to tell you not to worry about you-know-what. There was nothing there that had anything to do with that. After a few more sentences, Diana put back the receiver with a hand that shook slightly. For nearly half a minute, she stared blankly at the opposite wall until she picked up the telephone again and spoke. Sarah, you know that parcel in the safe? You'll find it's full of letters. Please see that they're put in the post straight away. They must go off tonight. She turned back to Janet Tuley. This, Janet, is where we take the lid off. Those letters are invitations to all my clients, and to some of the press, to attend a meeting next Wednesday afternoon. What I'd like you to do is start a rumour going that will back up the letter. Very well, but what's the rumour? We'd better stick to seaweed for the moment. Yes, something along those lines. And we'll hope for a good full haul on Wednesday. A black saloon car tore past Richard and Zephany and cut in ahead. A panel bearing the word police flashed on. An arm protruding from the driver's window waved them down. What the devil? Said Richard as he slowed. We weren't doing anything, were we? Zephany asked. A moment after they had stopped, another vehicle drew up alongside, a small van with no lettering on it. A man got out and put his hand in his pocket. At the same time, he jerked open the door beside Richard and held up a pistol. The door on the other side opened just as suddenly. Another man said, Out! To Zephany. Into the van, he added, thrusting forward his pistol. Zephany and Richard, each with a pistol pressing their backs, were shepherded to the rear and into the van. The two men climbed in after them and shut the door. The room was large. The man who sat behind the leather-topped desk had turned the lamp so that it shone in Zephany's eyes and left his own face a pale blur in the shadow. She stood a little to his right, with one of the men from the van close behind her. Richard stood a little to the left, his hands bound behind him, a piece of tape across his mouth. There is no malice in this, Miss Saxover," said the man behind the desk. "I simply want some information from you, and I intend to get it. It will be much pleasanter for everybody if you answer my questions truthfully. Now," he went on, "your father has made a very remarkable discovery. I'm sure you know what I mean."
"My father has made a lot of important discoveries," said Zephany.
The man's left hand tapped the desk. The man beside Richard clenched his fist and made a short, powerful jab at Richard's stomach. Richard gave a muffled gasp and folded forward. "Let's not waste time," said the man at the desk. "You tell me which discovery I mean." Zephany looked round helplessly. She made to move, but two hands from behind grasped her upper arms firmly. She kicked back with her heel. The man promptly stamped on her other foot. Before she could recover, he'd pulled off both her shoes and thrown them away. The man at the desk tapped his left hand again. A fist thudded against Richard's head. "We have no wish to harm you, if it can be helped, Miss Saxover, but we don't much mind how far we have to go with your friend here. It will be very, very unpleasant for him." There was another thud on her right and a groan. She trembled. Another thud.
"Oh, God, stop!"
she cried. "That's better. Now, the wonder drug is an extract of what? And please, don't say seaweed."
"Lichen. It's lichen," she told him.
"Quite right, Miss Saxover. You do know the answers. Now, this particular lichen, what is it called?"
"It hasn't got a proper name. It isn't classified," she managed.
"What does it look like? Describe it."
I can't. I've never seen it," said Zephany, tears running down her face.
The man sighed and turned out the light. "She's all right, physically. They didn't harm her," Francis's voice said. "But of course, she's badly shocked and distressed." "Poor Zephany," Diana said into the telephone. "How's the young man?" "Pretty badly knocked about, I'm afraid. Zephany says when she came around they were lying on the grass verge beside the car. Poor Richard looked a frightful mess. He's lost a few teeth, but there's no serious injury. The chief trouble is that she's in such a state about it. But what could she do? Each time she lied, he suffered." "Poor child. How much did she tell them?" "Pretty much everything she knew, I think, except that your side of it was never raised at all." "But they know where we get it now?" "Yes, I'm afraid they do." "Oh, dear." There was silence at the end of the telephone. "You're still there?" asked Francis. "Yes. Francis, this is everything I've been working for. The idea of an Antigerone must be put over. They must demand it." "Very well. It's too late to stop now, but please do be careful, Diana." On the Thursday morning, following her carefully orchestrated announcement, Diana tackled a stack of newspapers with the avidity of a rising star after a first night. As she continued to work through them, however, her eagerness wilted. The Times had nothing, nor did the Guardian. A small paragraph on the woman's page of the News Chronicle mentioned that a famous beauty specialist had announced a new treatment claiming unusual efficacy in the preservation of youthful beauty. "Very disappointing," said Miss Talwyn in sympathy. "If only you'd been able to give it some news value." Diana stared at her. "Good heavens, Sarah, what do you mean? It's the greatest news since Adam." "They've decided it's a publicity stunt, I'm afraid." "They've just willfully pretended not to understand it. The clients understood it all right, most of them. Oh, perhaps it was naive to expect an immediate explosion. But there are the Sundays to come yet. Some of them are bound to make a thing of it, surely." As things turned out, Diana did not have to wait for the Sundays. For it was on the afternoon of that same Thursday that the Threadneedle and Western Assurance Company declared a moratorium on the payment of annuities and guaranteed incomes as a purely temporary measure undertaken with regret, pending legal opinion on the obligations of the company in cases where means have been employed to extend the normal expectation of life. The Times restricted its comments to the financial page and the effects on insurance stocks. The Express, the Mail and the News Chronicle all made reference to Miss Brackley's claims, but preserved a careful vagueness on details. There was, for instance, no suggested figure of the life increase, just an indefinite proposition that people might be able to live longer, and in each case it was given a not-too-committal position of only semi-validity on the woman's page. Diana started Saturday by granting requests for interviews. Mounting pressure, however, caused her to abandon her piecemeal approach and arrange a full-scale press conference. It was a gathering which started with a high content of cynicism, flippancy, and a peppering of ribaldry. She grew a little short with it and broke off her introduction to say, "Look here, I didn't promote this meeting. It was you who were anxious to meet me. I'm not trying to sell you anything. I don't give a damn whether you believe what I say or not. It doesn't make any difference to the facts. Now, let's get on with it. You ask the questions. I'll give you some of the answers." Nobody convinces a gathering of the press 100%. Nevertheless, when the representatives dispersed, several of them were looking more subdued and thoughtful than they had when they arrived. It was difficult to tell which of Sunday's papers had rejected it, and which had considered it unworthy of their layouts. Some gave it a guarded mention, but neither the Prole nor the Radar had doubts of its readability, and went to town on it. "Does a woman want to live 200 years?" asked the Prole. "How many lifetimes will you have?" inquired the Radar. Diana, skipping through the columns with a rueful smile, was interrupted by her telephone. "Sarah here, Miss Brackley," said Miss Tolwyn, a little breathless. "Have you got the home service on?" "No," said Diana. "I was looking at the papers." "I think you ought to listen to it, Miss Brackley." Diana pressed the radio key. A voice swelled in, saying, "An act of aggression has been committed in the territory of Almighty God. To the other sins of science, which are many, are now added those of pride and arrogant opposition to the will of God. The days of our lives are 70. That is the law of God, for it is the law of the form he gave us. Now, science, in its impious vanity, challenges the designs of the architect of the universe. It is unthinkable that the laws of this Christian land should countenance this flagrant attack upon the nature of man as he was created by God." Diana listened thoughtfully to the end and switched off the wireless. The Rolls pulled up before Dar House rather in the manner of a large yacht losing its way. Diana set it to rest in the car park and walked across to the yard, climbed a familiar staircase and knocked on the door at the top. Francis opened it and stared at his visitor. "Good heavens, Diana! What are you doing here? Come in!" She stepped into the sitting room. There were half a dozen Sunday papers lying about untidily. The room looked smaller than her memory of it, and less ascetic. "Are you satisfied with this?" he asked, waving a hand towards the crumpled newspapers. "On the whole, and as a beginning, yes," Diana told him. "I have built up my core, my living examples. The next step is to get it across to the masses." Francis frowned. "I'm not sure what your intentions are, Diana. Do you see yourself marching at the head of a monstrous regiment of women, addressing mass rallies? Perhaps the spirit of your militant aunt is tempting you to see yourself sitting on the front bench." Diana shook her head. "You're confusing the means with the end, Francis. I don't want to lead all these women. I'm just making use of them, deceiving them, if you care to say so. They think I'm offering them more of the same life. I'm not. I'm cheating them. All my life, I've been watching potentially brilliant women let their brains and their talents rot away. I could weep for the waste of it. Now, There will finally be time to do really great things at last. Francis interlocked his fingers and stared down at them. You'll be risking a lot. I would advise caution as regards your personal safety. For which you take it upon yourself to feel some responsibility, Diana remarked brusquely. Francis shook his head. I'm sorry if you regard it as interference. I thought you might understand. I understand, she said with sudden bitterness. I understand very well. You are a father feeling concern for his daughter. Her mouth trembled. Damn you, Francis. I ought never to have come here. She got up and walked back to the window. At length, Francis said, I am old enough to be your father. As if that ever mattered. Don't you understand, Francis? We've changed that. How much older than I are you now? He went on looking at her, but with a new, rather bewildered expression in his eyes. Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to another programme in our Newsmaker series. Our Newsmaker this week has certainly been in the headlines these last few days. I am, of course, talking about Miss Diana Brackley. Well, Miss Brackley, your announcement last week certainly seems to have created something of a stir. One rather expected it would, Mr. Pigeon. Just in case some of our viewers happen to have missed seeing the papers lately, do you think you could give us quite simply the essence of your announcement? It is quite simple. It is that if people wish to live longer lives, the means to do so is now available. I see. And you claim that you have developed a form of treatment which will ensure this? I don't think we need loaded questions, Mr. Pigeon. I beg your pardon? Do you claim to have had breakfast this morning, Mr. Pigeon? Well, exactly. Miss Brackley, you announced that a number of people have already had treatment from you, which will have this effect. I did. How many people, roughly? Several hundred people. All women? Yes, but that is an effect of circumstances. It is equally effective with men. And how long are these people going to live? But I couldn't possibly tell you, Mr. Pigeon. How long are you going to live? But I understood that you claimed, said. What I said was that their average expectation of life had been increased. That is quite different from saying how long anyone is going to live. For one thing, when you double the expectation of life, you also double the chances of a fatal accident, and it appears likely that you more than double susceptibility to illness. But, barring accidents and serious illness, someone whose expectation has been trebled could live to see her 200th birthday? Yes. Well, now, Miss Brackley, it has been stated by more than one newspaper that none of these people you've been treating with your antigerone was aware that she was having this treatment until you made your announcement a few days ago. I think one or two may have guessed. You mean you don't deny it? Why should I want to deny it, Mr. Pigeon? Well, I should have thought it was rather a grave charge to make. I mean, here are all these people coming along and putting themselves in your hands in good faith, and there are you treating them with this antigerone which is going to make them live 200 years without even telling them about it. It seems to me that it could be a pretty serious matter.
It's quite simple, Mr. Pigeon. I run a business that we are not allowed to name over the air, and these ladies came to me as clients and said they wanted their youth and beauty preserved. Well, that's jargon, of course. No one can preserve it. But I said I could prolong it for them. They said that was what they meant, really, so that's what I've done.
Well, it is hardly what they must have expected, Miss Brackley.
You're implying that they expected to be deceived, and that I am guilty of giving them what they asked for, instead of the deception they expected. Is that it, Mr. Pigeon?
Well,
I really can't think you're on very firm ground there. The whole of my trade professes to prolong youth and beauty. I am the one member who does what she is asked, who delivers the goods. And you talk about a grave charge. I just don't understand you, Mr. Pigeon.
Miss Brackley, it has been suggested that if the antigerone were to be widely used, indeed, if it is used at all, it will have far-reaching effects upon our social system. Would you agree with that?
Certainly.
What sort of effects do you envisage?
Can you think of anything that would not be affected if we were all to have the opportunity of living 200 years?
I believe that as yet, Miss Brackley, there has not been any scientific investigation into your into the antigerone.
That is a mistake, Mr. Pigeon. I have, as a biochemist, investigated it very thoroughly.
Well, shall we say independent investigation?
Not yet.
Would you welcome such an investigation?
Why should I welcome it? I'm perfectly satisfied with the efficacy of the antigerone.
Let us say, then, would you object to it?
Again, why should I? Frankly, Mr. Pigeon, I don't give a damn. The one thing to be said in favour of an investigation is that it might perhaps lead on to the discovery of other, perhaps preferable, types of antigerone.
Miss Brackley, one thing that has been causing a lot of speculation is the nature of the antigerone. Could you perhaps tell us the source of this substance?
I prefer not to disclose it just yet.
Don't you think, Miss Brackley, that it would inspire more confidence if you could give us some indication?
We seem to be rather at cross purposes, Mr. Pigeon. What makes you think I want to inspire confidence? I'm not a faith healer or a politician. The antigerone exists, and it doesn't depend on confidence for its results. Janet Tuley stepped to the window.
Oh, Diana, what an adorable garden, right up here. No one would ever suspect it.
I love my little garden, Diana said, straightening up and pulling off her gloves. I'm glad you managed to get in.
My dear, without your special permit, I'd not have gotten here. You seem to have a whole corps of commissionaires to guard you.
It's necessary, unfortunately, said Diana. I had to smuggle out in a tradesman's van to get to that broadcast on Monday, and send a decoy to the front entrance so I could get safely back again. Come and sit down. We'll have some coffee while you tell me what's been going on.
I can't stay long. I'm frantically busy. But, Diana, my dear, I do lift my hat to you. Now we've really looked ourselves over, we seem to be wives or daughters of half the establishment. We're married to 4 cabinet ministers, 3 other ministers, 2 bishops, 3 earls, 5 viscounts, half a dozen banks and lots of others. In addition, We have close relations that are not quite marital, with a lot of other influences. And so you see, one way or another, there isn't much we don't know, or can't get to know.
That's what I want, said Diana. In the last 3 days, I've had practically nothing but what the newspapers have told me. I gather that the chief trouble has come from the trumpeter.
Oh, yes. There was a lovely row there. Exploitation of the workers. Prospect of 3 lifetimes spent at the factory bench. Inevitable rise in unemployment. On the way here, I passed a wall in Notting Hill scrawled with "Ban Anti-G. All out on demo, Trafalgar Square, Sunday." We hear the PM's very unhappy indeed, poor man. If he sanctions use of the anti-G, there'll be chaos everywhere. If he tries to ban it, there'll be an outcry, a near revolution. Of course, if he does agree to sanction it, then there'll be the whole question of dealing with China. China? Diana exclaimed in dismay. Then she recollected Richard and Zephany's uncomfortable experience. From Zephany's account, there had been 3 men there when she had admitted the source of the supply. It could have leaked out from any one of them. "What about China?" Diana asked. "It is said to be the only source of the particular lichen that yields the antigerone," Janet said, her eyes on Diana's face. "I see." Diana's voice and expression were non-committal. "So, once the Chinese find out why we want to buy their lichen, well, that will finish that," continued Janet. "They'll want it for themselves, and even if they don't, we'd be a long way down on the list of customers." Diana went back to the window and out into the little garden. She stood there, looking out over the treetops of the park for nearly 10 minutes before she returned. Her manner was brisk. "Janet, I want to broadcast. I don't care what service, but sometime on a Saturday evening. I want to tell them all about the antigerone, to answer all the questions I wouldn't answer before." Diana awoke to the ringing of the telephone beside her bed. She reached for it reluctantly. "Yes," she said.
"Diana, it's Zephany."
"What is it, Zephany?"
"Oh, Diana, it's Dar again. It's all been burnt right out this time. Daddy's been taken to hospital."
Diana's heart jumped suddenly, and she clutched the receiver.
"Oh, Zephany, what's happened to him?" "It's all right. He's not badly hurt, not burnt, I mean. He had to jump out of the window and he's rather shaken up. Only a few bruises, the hospital says."
"Oh, thank God for that. What happened, Zephany?"
"We're not quite sure. It seems like a raid. Apparently, they threw lighted bottles of something through the windows, not petrol, something fiercer."
"Have the police any idea who did it?"
"I don't think so. They said they had reason to believe that it was a gang from somewhere else."
"Masterly deduction, that."
"Yes. By the way, Diana, what's this about another broadcast? Is it true?"
"Yes. How did you hear?"
"They slipped it in amongst the announcements before the news this morning. What are you going to tell them?"
"All about it, Zephany. If I don't do it publicly now, I can see them putting me under some kind of subpoena to do it more privately before long. Publicly would be better, I think."
"But nothing about Daddy?"
"He's got more than enough trouble on his hands at the moment. Goodbye, Zephany, and don't forget to tell him that
I won't, Diana. I won't."
Diana searched through the papers for news of the Dar House disaster. Apparently it had come in too late for even the London editions, but there was plenty of reference to the antigerone. Indeed, in almost all the popular papers, some shift of attitude was perceptible, almost as though word had been going around Fleet Street that the antigerone had potentialities beyond that of increasing the female readership. To Diana, the most interesting and also most gratifying feature was negative. Scarcely anywhere was there a disposition to question the validity of the antigerone. Where she had expected to find the first barricades, there was almost no resistance. Whatever the causes, Diana could perceive that the fight was not going to be quite the free-for-all she had envisaged, but something more like a large-scale tourney with a large spectatorship whose favour could be swayed to one side or the other. However, reading in each newspaper that the Saturday night play on the home service would be postponed from 9:15 to 9:30 in order to give Miss Diana Brackley the opportunity of making a statement regarding the Antigerone, she was able to feel that the next phase could now begin. The lift doors opened, and a small party stepped out into the hall. First, Diana, in a pale grey evening dress, long white gloves, an emerald pendant, and a light fur-collared wrap about her shoulders. And behind her, Lucy Brendan and Sarah Tolwyn, dressed less strikingly, but also with an air of occasion. The hall porter left his desk and came forward with an air of concern. "There's quite a crowd outside, Miss Brackley," he told her. Diana glanced through the glass panels of the door. The crowd must number nearly 100, she judged, predominantly feminine, but with a score or so of men, including 2 with press cameras. The porter crossed the hall to the door, unlocked it, and stepped outside. His gesture to the crowd was quite imperious, and after a brief hesitation it parted reluctantly. The 3 ladies, with Diana in the lead, stepped forward. Across the pavement, the underporter, who had brought the grey rolls around, held the door open, ready for her. Lucy caught a voice saying, "40, they say. Looks like a girl, don't she?" Diana crossed the broad top step and started down. The 2 photographers let off their flashes. 3 loud cracks sounded, fast upon one another. Diana staggered and clutched at her left side. The crowd stood frozen. A red mark appeared below Diana's hand. Blood trickled out between her white-gloved fingers. A widening patch of scarlet dyed the pale grey silk. Diana took a half-step back, collapsed, and slithered down the steps. The photographer's flash blinked again. The underporter left the car door and jumped towards her. Diana lay limp, her eyes closed. The 2 porters made as if to lift her, but a voice said quietly, with authority, "Don't move her." The porter looked around to see a youngish man wearing horn-rimmed glasses and a well-cut dark suit. "I'm a doctor," he said. "You might do her harm. Better send for an ambulance at once." He bent over Diana and picked up her hand to feel her pulse. The porter ran back up the steps towards the phone, but found himself forestalled. Lucy Brendan was already at his desk, telephone in hand. "An ambulance, yes, quick," she said, then hung up. "Did you get him?" she demanded. "Who?" asked the porter. "The man who did it. A little man in a raincoat with a green felt hat. He was on the left," she told him, as she ran down the steps to Diana and the doctor. The porter followed and looked over the crowd. There was no centre of commotion. The man must have got away before anyone realised what had happened. The doctor, kneeling beside Diana now, looked up, frowning anxiously. "That ambulance," he began. The sound of its bell interrupted him. It came down the street at speed and pulled in behind the rolls. The attendants got out, dragged out a stretcher, and shoved their way through the crowd. Half a minute later, Diana had been loaded aboard, and the ambulance went clanging away. The funeral took place on Wednesday. After it was over, the great crowd dispersed quietly. The police reinforcements that had stood by unneeded climbed into their vans and departed too. Only the mounds of flowers remained. But some 2 hours later, many of the faces seen at the funeral were to be seen again in Trafalgar Square. At 7 o'clock, the banners started to appear, bearing the legend, "The League for New Life." Elsewhere, several large portraits of Diana rose above the heads of the crowd, and there was one blown-up photograph of her taken as she lay on the steps. The crowd bulged and began to flow into the roadway on the south side. Hastily, the police held up the Whitehall traffic and formed a line across the road. The crowd rolled on. The line of police, scrabbling for foothold, bent in a bow and finally broke. A scattered cheer arose from further back, and the crowd flowed on. Presently, the front ranks began to chant. The volume of the chanting increased as they passed the end of Downing Street. "We want the anti-G! We want the anti-G!" they yelled. The multi-voice chant rebounding in echoes from the Abbey to the government offices, from the Central Hall to the face of the Houses of Parliament. As listeners to our later bulletins will have already heard, the Prime Minister addressed the House last night on the subject of the Antigerone. The government had, he said, for some little time been giving this matter their gravest consideration. The discovery of the Antigerone was a scientific triumph. However, at present it could only be derived in minute quantities from an extremely rare form of lichen. The Prime Minister stated, however, that it was the government's firm intention that this state of affairs be remedied as soon as possible. He therefore proposed an immediate grant of £10 million to subsidise research to this end. He concluded by stating that he had little doubt that British brains, British purpose, and British know-how would succeed in producing a supply of the Antigerone for every man and woman in the country who wished to use it. Francis Saxover stopped his car at the point where a white-gated lane led off from the secondary road. On the top bar of the gate was neatly lettered Glen Farm. By turning a little more left, he could see the house, a comfortable-looking house built of grey local stone and seeming to almost grow out of the hillside. It rested on a small shelf, looking out across the lake from shining white-framed windows. Blue smoke rose from one of the two chimney stacks and drifted back towards the fell side. After some moments' contemplation, he got out. He did not approach the house at once, but walked thoughtfully to the edge of the levelled shelf, where he stood looking out across the garden. Then, as he made to turn, something close to his feet caught his attention. He regarded it for some seconds, and then bent to pick it up. He looked at it expressionlessly as it lay in the palm of his hand. Then the corner of his mouth twitched slightly. He let the piece of lichen drop and turned towards the house. A staunch-looking country girl opened the door. "Mrs. Ingalls?" Francis inquired. I think she's in the barn, sir. What would be the name?" "Just say I'm from the Country Rating Authority." He was shown into a large, low, comfortable sitting room and was looking out of the window when the door opened. "Good morning," the familiar voice began. Francis turned. "Oh!" Diana exclaimed unsteadily. "Oh, God! I'm going to cry. I'm not a crier. Nobody ever made me cry but you. Oh, hell!" Stored, she said, "But how did you know, Francis? And 10 minutes later, and somewhat restored, she said, "But how did you know, Francis? And how did you know where to look?" "My dear, I was not born yesterday. There was nothing wrong with the act. It was a superb piece of sharp practice, but there were indications. Your sudden visit to Dar, your manner, certain choices of phrase. Finding out about Mrs. Ingalls, who lived here, was more difficult. I've taken some trouble getting Mrs. Ingalls well established here. It was less difficult than it might have been, though, because I am Mrs. Ingalls." Francis stared at her, taken aback. "Is he... are you..." Diana shook her head. "When I say I am Mrs. Ingalls, I mean I could be, by common parlance, though I must say the practice of divorcing one's husband but hanging on to his surname strikes me as pretty moot." She paused and went on. "It was a long time ago. When you're young, when you have been shocked, when what you really wanted has gone beyond your reach, you're apt to look desperately for a new way of living. That doesn't make a good basis for a marriage. It was brief and unhappy. Are you satisfied with the job now? Francis asked. She turned her grey eyes steadily upon him. I know you disapprove. Sharp practice, you said just now, and I'm aware that that is a mild, polite term compared with what a lot of people would be saying if they knew. All right. It was an unscrupulous piece of manipulation. I don't care. There are things that are too important, too necessary, for a few convenient scruples to stand in their way. And for me, this is one of them. I'm not proud of the means, but I'm satisfied with the job so far. There could have been bloodshed, even something like civil war. But we've got this far without any of that. When people have had time to think it over, there'll be more trouble. Lots of it, probably. But it's too late to matter. The children have been promised their sweets, and they'll raise hell if they're not forthcoming. But they will forthcome. Both the Americans and the Russians have now made bigger allocations for research than we have. A nation's science simply has to keep up with the Joneses these days. She paused. She regarded Francis's face carefully for nearly half a minute, then turned her own away. You're shocked. You! She exclaimed. I wonder how your shock compares with the shock to a young woman who finds that the central ethic of her calling is being violated by... Oh, God, are you going to make me say it, Francis? When the sun, setting behind the opposite mountains, brought shadows creeping across the lake, Francis's car was still parked beside Glen Farm. Within the house, the really important decisions had been taken. But on the couch before the fire, lesser points of merely general importance continued to raise themselves. Have you any reserves of Lichen? Asked Francis. Quite a bit. It's got to do for Sarah and Lucy and several others. Also there's Janet, and some more that I shall have to do something about, unless the research produces results within 2 or 3 years. I can't let them down altogether. Which would mean letting them know you're still alive. They'd be almost bound to find out sooner or later. When were you going to let me know? Oh, Francis, don't. That was the worst part. I don't think I could have held out very long. And if there are no results in, say, 3 years, you will have a new supply? He asked. Oh, you noticed that, did you? Yes. It seems to have taken here quite well, but of course it won't be possible to produce more than a very little, the same old problem. They sat looking at the flames, licking the logs. Francis reached for her hand. This isn't going to be very easy, you know, he told her. You certainly can't simply reappear again after all this. Heaven knows what would happen to you. So, even if I were to decide to rebuild Dar, we couldn't go there. I suppose it means we shall have to go abroad somewhere. Oh, I've got all that arranged. We can stay here. It's a nice house, don't you think? You'll have married Mrs. Ingalls. You did it quietly, because if it were known that Mrs. Ingalls was Diana Brackley's younger sister, there would naturally be a lot of publicity, which neither of you wanted. For the same reason, you both decided to go on living here, quietly, for a few years. There's lots of room, Francis. I'll show you round after dinner. I've often thought the room over the dining room would make a lovely nursery. Well, then, when you become a public figure again, we've only got to stick firmly to the poor Diana's younger sister line. Incidentally, poor Diana was shot 3 times. What of her wounds? Blanks, darling, and a little thing they use on television. When you press it, red ink spurts out. Frightfully gruesome looking. What you were saying, Diana, about my becoming a public figure again. Well, we can't both sit down here and do nothing for 200 or 300 years, can we? That's what people are going to find out. I've got quite a nice lab fixed up in the barn so we can work there. That's where you are going to determine the basic molecule of the antigerone, which will certainly make you a public figure. Come along, darling. I'll show you.